Welcome to the second video of Chapter 8. In this video, we're going to begin by talking about Section 8.4, which is entitled Problems Facing Human Capital Formation in India. The book mentions that the Indian government is well aware of its problems in terms of human capital formation, and there are 5 areas in which they need to focus, namely, its rising population, brain drain, deficient manpower planning, insufficient on the job training in the primary sector, and low academic standards. So let's take a look at each of these individually. So, a rising population. Well, the population growth is so rapid that India has difficulty meeting the demands of that population, basically in terms of sanitation, housing, drainage, hospital care, all types of different areas. India's resources are stretched to their maximum because the population is rising far too rapidly. Brain drain, the second topic, brain drain, is rather interesting. And what it is people who are educated or skilled realize that they don't want to stay in India any longer. And what's the reason for this? Well, the reason's quite simple. They're able to go and live a comfortable life in the United States or in Europe or in Japan or wherever else it may be. And so they leave and they don't return. And so India loses its skilled or talented people. Oftentimes, they'll leave for the purpose of going to university, and after university, they'll just stay locally wherever they are and they don't return. Next, this is basically referring to an issue of not being able to capitalize on its resources. And what is its resource in this case? Basically, human skilled labor. So the Indian government doesn't know what to do with its people, and basically, there's no jobs for them. So they're unfortunately at a disadvantage here, and people get frustrated when they don't have work. And if they don't have work and they're frustrated, they'll do anything they can to survive, which often means engaging in illegal activities. Next, insufficient on the job training in the primary sector. Well, the agricultural sector just throws people into work without actually explaining to them what it is that they're trying to do or what it is that they have to do. And as a result of this, people are unskilled, they don't do a good job, and the yields on the crops in the field are oftentimes far less than what they should be. And finally, low academic standards. Well, this is something that's a little peculiar because the number of universities has risen rapidly and the number of students engaging in education is always on the rise. But the problem here is because there are so many people and because the population is growing so rapidly and because the demand for education is so significant that there's nobody really controlling the quality of the educational institutions themselves. Let's move on to the second slide, which is entitled Education as an Essential Element of Human Resource Development. There are 9 particular areas mentioned in the book here: the expansion of general education, elementary education, senior and secondary education, higher education, vocationalization of secondary education, technical, medical, and agricultural education, rural education, adult and female education, and total literacy campaign. So I'm going to try and combine a bunch of these together. Let's talk about how the primary and middle school, as well as the senior and secondary number of schools, has grown rapidly between 1951 and 2011. The blue colored lines here represent the number of schools available in 1950-51, and the green represents the number of schools that were active between 2011 and 2012. The number of primary schools has jumped significantly. But as you can also see from this graph, the number of senior and secondary schools, although it's risen, it hasn't risen as significantly. Moving on to higher levels of education, the number of colleges have rapidly increased, and as well, the number of universities have also rapidly increased. So what's happened to the student enrollment? As you can imagine, the number of students has also rapidly increased at these institutions, primary and middle, senior and secondary, and as well as university. Unfortunately, they don't provide any college data. Now, it's true that these statistics show rapid increases, but there's a couple of things here. One is the base effect, which we've already learned, that the beginning numbers are so low that any increases look significant. Secondly, we don't know the extent to which the population has grown over this time. So, is it really clear that more people as a percentage of the entire population are getting access to education and actually improving their human capital formation? Well, the one way we can say that that's true is we can see that the increase in the literacy rate between 1951 and 2011 jumped from 16% all the way to 74%. Now, you might be saying, wow, that's good. The Indian population is now 74% literate. The global average is 90. So they're still far behind the global average. And in our case here in Japan, we're at 99%. So there's still lots of room for improvement. And 74 is by no means a measure of success. Moving on, there's an interesting article in the book in the middle of the chapter that talks about the paradoxical truth about elementary school education in India. And what it mentions is that there's a ratio called the gross enrollment ratio. And this ratio is merely the number of students enrolled in elementary schools divided by the number of people in India between the ages of 6 and 14. Now, in any country, this ratio should be high, close to 100. But it should never, ever be over 100. But unbelievably, in India, it's often over 100. And the reason being simply is that people enroll in elementary school education when they're 15, 16, 17, because they were unable to complete it when they were between 6 and 14. And as a result, the gross enrollment ratio is often over 100%. So we've seen that the gross enrollment rates are high. We've seen that the number of students going to the schools are increasing rapidly. We've also seen that the literacy rate is improving rapidly. So, why is education still a challenging proposition? Well, there are 6 big challenges to the education system in India. First of all, is that there are a large number of people who are illiterate, and that means they're unable to read and write. And this represents about 36 crore people. It's not something that can be ignored. Secondly, although education continues to improve, it's not being taught such that people are able to harness a specific skill. So, vocationalization is still in its infancy. Next, there's a gender bias. This doesn't really need much of an explanation. Women are discriminated against and often receive lower levels of education. Rural areas have limited access to education, as it's difficult to build schools in rural areas because the amount of money needed to set up a facility is significant. And oftentimes in rural areas, the population is just too insignificant for us to be able to invest in a school because the startup costs are far too much. Privatization, there's been a lot of movement in privatization, which means individual firms are actually going about setting up educational programs around the country. But why is this a problem? Well, because there's no control on what people are educating and how much they're charging for fees. And then lastly, low government expenditure on education compared to the rest of the world. India is not spending as much on education as they should be, and this is a big problem. If they spent more on education and they had a better control of the system in general, they would be able to improve their human capital formation significantly. What have we learned at the end of chapter 8? Well, human capital formation is suffering, but there are areas of improvement, especially with regards to education. The literacy rate has climbed significantly. The number of enrollees in schools has climbed significantly. The infrastructure, meaning the facilities themselves, have also increased significantly. So it appears as if India is heading in the right track. But as the paradoxical formula earlier, which explained the enrollment ratio, shows, people are not getting an education at the appropriate time. They're often having to go back to school after the age of 14. So elementary school education is probably not being administered as effectively as it could be.